Metroid Dread is a good game. I think at this point in time that has been well established. If you are looking at the gameplay footage in the trailers and it looks like you would enjoy your time with the game, you probably will. It really is that simple. Any critiques of the game that I have should be prefaced with this information. If I had to pinpoint a thesis of some kind for this video, it would probably be that this Metroidvania, or Metroid, is rather linear for what I've come to understand as a Metroidvania. That's not even necessarily a bad thing. Linearity isn't inherently bad and is often a good thing, but I think it's worth talking about regardless when comparing what we do or don't like with our Metroidvania games. For context on myself, before Metroid Dread I had never played a Metroid game or a Castlevania game. My first Metroidvania was Hollow Knight, a game that really spoiled me because I think it handled the genre really well. The only other Metroidvanias I've played have been non-Metroid or Vania titles such as Blasphemous and Ori, so my understanding of how Metroidvania should work stem in large part from these games. I was really excited to play Metroid Dread because I had the expectation of getting at the root of what this genre had to offer. I thought this would be the bread and butter of what a Metroidvania would be, and I don't believe that's what I found. And that's my spoiler-free review of the game for you. There's a spoiler-free review by Arlo as well in the description of this video if you want more detail about the game before you buy it, but from this point going forward there will be mild spoilers for Metroid Dread and Hollow Knight. At the beginning of the game, the authors were so kind as to catch us up with the story of the series so far, and this is very much appreciated for what I would assume would be the vast majority of the player base of Metroid Dread. I'm sure I'm not the only person here who's playing a Metroid game for the first time after all. And while this may be an ignorant statement coming from me, I get the sense that people don't play Metroid for the story. I can't get myself invested in it. I think the thing that really breaks the immersion for me is how Samus has to lose all of her abilities at the beginning of each game in order for the game to work. She can't start off with all the abilities that she had in the last game or things would be too easy. So the plot has to take this sudden drop in quality in order to meet the expectations of the gameplay. I probably shouldn't complain about the plot much more than that. It's just frustrating how the plot has to bend so hard for the gameplay when the setting is begging to have an incredible plot to it. This feels like a game that should have an incredible story, but we'll be focusing on the gameplay for this video. From the very beginning of the game, it is made very clear what your end goal is. Samus needs to return to her ship. That's basically it. You begin at the very bottom of the map and you need to find your way all the way up to the top of the map where your ship is located. It's very simply laid out to you this way. And right off the bat, this sets the tone for an incredibly linear structure in a game. I'm going to be comparing Metroid Dread to Hollow Knight a decent bit throughout this video. I hope that doesn't make anyone too mad. I have very limited experiences with Metroidvanias as mentioned previously, and I think Hollow Knight helps draw some very helpful comparisons as I hope you will see. When you begin your quest in Hollow Knight, you don't have a clear goal. As it turns out, the final boss is located near the first parts of the game, but you don't know that. Your goal is simply to explore. Eventually, at the heart of the map, you get your main objective, but you can't complete this objective without first going to 3 separate points on the map and completing objectives there. You can take on these 3 objectives in any order from many angles. It's not linear as you would expect a Metroidvania to behave. Metroid Dread isn't like this, however. Every step you take is one step on your way to your primary objective. Get back to the ship, just like Mario getting to the flagpole at the end of the level. Actually, if you put yourself in Samus's shoes, you don't actually want to explore the world and see how everything fits together. You're just trying to get out of the world the best you can, and exploring the world is a sort of necessary chore Samus has to get done in order to get to the end of the game. This instantly sets the tone of linearity, which doesn't seem to exemplify the design of Metroidvanias very well. This linearity expresses itself even more so with the ability collection in this game. Like most Metroidvanias, collecting new abilities is how you progress through the game, but usually this isn't done linearly. Typically, as you're exploring a Metroidvania, you will encounter roadblocks that require abilities to progress. One of the goals of integrating this gameplay loop into your games is to make the process feel natural, and as though the player is being empowered, not checking off boxes to get to the next area. A really easy example I'll pull from most Metroidvanias would be the double jump ability. All you have to do to implement double jump progression is to create a ledge that is too high to reach with a normal jump. The player sees they can't reach it, wonders what's up there, takes a mental note, and moves on until they get the double jump, then treks back to all of the places similar to this one. This doesn't hurt any immersion or the player's empowerment because I as the player can accept that there are just cliffs that are higher than others, and that's just a thing that happens, man. Now, compare this example to the motion sensing doors in Metroid Dread. You can't get past these doors without an invisibility cloak that you unlock pretty early in the game. To me, these doors ended up feeling like checks designed to keep the player on rails, and I think that's mostly because these doors aren't found anywhere past the first parts of the game. It's incredibly convenient to have the doors that you get past with invisibility to be located in the same place where you get the invisibility power-up. It doesn't feel natural. This door may as well be a Pokemon NPC that says, "Sorry, Samus, you can't go this way because there's construction going on." But hey, maybe if you fight that boss over there, the construction will be done by the time you're finished conveniently, Lamau XD. It would feel more natural if these motion sensing doors made more appearances in later parts of the game, but that wouldn't serve the gameplay of Metroid Dread in any meaningful way. And therein lies one of the biggest dilemmas of Metroid Dread. There's a tension between the abilities Metroid Dread wants you to have and how those abilities can actually be implemented into the exploration. This game wants you to have these abilities, but it wants the player to collect them in a specific order, so it sacrifices the exploratory freedom that is typically understood as an important element in Metroidvanias. To sort of tie this point up into a bow, I think unlocking abilities in the same area you need those abilities makes Metroidvanias feel linear, especially when you basically only use those abilities in that area and almost nowhere else. There were points halfway through the game where I would run into a new obstacle that I hadn't really seen before, like these fire plants or whatever, and I'd be like, oh, guess this must be the area where I unlocked the fire plant deleter thing, and sure enough, ice missiles for some reason, and now I just won't ever see the fire plants in later parts of the game. But this issue could have potentially been avoided had it not been for one major issue I think Metroid Dread suffers from. Metroid Dread has too many abilities. In Hollow Knight, there are a total of 9 abilities that are needed to travel to get to new areas you couldn't access otherwise. One of these abilities is only used a single time at the beginning of the game, unless you use it for speedrun strats, so there's kinda 8 abilities, and not all of those abilities are required to beat the game. You can beat the game without unlocking the Shade Cloak. You can kinda beat the game without the Monarchlings if you got the skills. There are other abilities related to combat that you can unlock, but they aren't ever really used for getting to other areas. Blasphemous doesn't require that you unlock any abilities at all. You can actually beat the whole game just fine without any of these items needed to open up new spaces, because all of these spaces just offer collectibles for prayers or something not required to beat the game. Metroid Dread has 26 upgrades that you unlock through its relatively short game length of around 7 to 10 hours. If you aren't a speedrunner, all of these abilities are required to beat the game. You can't miss out on a single one of them. There's no optional challenge to try and beat the game without one of them. I've heard some people argue that the game is beatable without the space jump, and I think that you could hypothetically beat the game without the pulse radar if you know where all the hidden blocks are, but if you beat this game, you're not likely going to beat it blind with any missing abilities. The game makes sure to lead you to every single one of them. This feels even more off-putting with the abilities that upgrade your weapons. You can get the charge beam so that you can shoot a more powerful shot, but it's also used to unlock those orange doors over there. You can unlock the wide beam, which lets you shoot 3 shots at once, which is cool, but it's also used for these blocks that require 3 shots at the exact same time for some reason. Imagine if in Hollow Knight, every room was blocked off by a rock that you had to break with your nail, but some walls were a different kind of rock that required an upgraded nail to break. So you had to find the pale ore and see the nailsmith in order to get past a certain rock wall. Or imagine if the nail arts were required to access new areas, like you need the cyclone nail to access a certain area somehow. That's kinda how Metroid Dread feels. Metroid Dread can't give you an upgrade to one of your weapons that doesn't also unlock a new path somehow. The game can't separate combat upgrades from exploration upgrades, and the abundance of upgrades makes things even more annoying than that because this game has these special blocks that can only be destroyed with a certain ability. Like, explosions from missiles are very different from the explosions from the bombs, so you can't just blow up missile blocks with the bomb blocks, silly. That would make these abilities too redundant for our level design. And another thing that Metroid Dread does that really solidifies its linearity in my mind is the fact that once you achieve certain progression points in the game, new obstacles will spawn in, preventing you from going back without an upgrade that you won't get for another 3 to 4 hours of gameplay. With my experience of Metroidvanias, this design choice baffles me. I think Hollow Knight has one part where the passages are blocked off after a big change in the first area, but other than that, why would you design the game this way unless you wanted the player to be on rails throughout the whole game? There was one time I got a new ability that allowed me to survive in rooms that were really hot, and I figured I should go back to all the rooms I couldn't approach previously to see if there were any collectibles I could snag. And I remember feeling punished for thinking that way because all of these rooms almost always required another ability or two that I didn't have yet. Felt like I'm better off waiting until I have every ability in the game before I backtrack just to be safe. How can you design a Metroidvania that requires the player to get 26 upgrades in a sub 10-hour game without making the game feel linear? And so I've come up with a hypothesis regarding Metroidvania design philosophy. Too many required abilities makes Metroidvanias too linear, because for every required ability, there has to be an obstacle that has to be shoved in as well. And if there's too many obstacles, they have to be placed around the map in such a way as to not interfere with one another. I thought this hypothesis was sound until I remembered that I just finished playing Fearmonium last year, and I'm quite glad that I found an excuse to talk about this game. Fearmonium kinda suffers from the same issue of having so many upgrades. A good chunk of these abilities are required, but the game isn't very linear, and that may in large part be thanks to the size of the map, which is pretty huge. So maybe there's a balance that you have to make with the size of the game that needs to be adjusted depending on how many abilities you want the player to have, if you don't want your Metroidvania to feel linear, that is. But another thing that helps Fearmonium give the player a sense of freedom in exploration is the fact that Fearmonium actually has a good fast travel system. And I think that's the next topic that we need to touch on. Metroid Dread doesn't really have fast travel. I mean, it kind of does, but not really. Here, let me just... Okay, yeah, let's pretend for the sake of this video, right, that this is a rough representation of what the Hollow Knight map looks like, okay? This isn't what Hollow Knight actually looks like. The map is a lot more interesting than this, okay? But let's just pretend for the sake of the video that this is what it looks like, okay? Here's like a rough representation of how the fast travel works, okay? You got this nice big open map, a whole bunch of different areas, right? And then you got like a stag station, right? And the stag stations are like they're effectively teleporters, and they, you know, teleport you throughout the map. They're like kind of spread out kind of somewhat evenly, right? So, you know, you can take any of these teleporters or stag stations and go to any of these locations, and that's basically how the fast travel works. So it's nice and convenient. You can go to each one from each one. It doesn't really matter. And that's effectively how the fast travel in Hollow Knight works, right? And now let's compare that to like a rough representation of Metroid Dread's map. Okay, so here's Metroid Dread's map, kind of, sort of, like it's all like these different areas, and there's like direct paths to them in the form of like trains and elevators and stuff like that, and that's how you like get from area to area, right? In this game, you don't have the stag station like fast travel system. What happens is you're going to be exploring an area. Let's say you're exploring this area, okay? So you're going around, you're exploring this area, and you encounter one part that's like blocked off. It's like this one square. You're like, I can't get into here. I guess I need to like find a new ability or something to get in here, right? So in the meantime, you go and go over here. You explore this area a little bit, and then what happens is you come across an area right around here that requires like another ability, right? And you don't have that ability, and then you find a teleporter, and the teleporter's right here, and you're like, oh, okay, there's fast travel. But no, this teleporter only teleports you to one place specifically, and that's in this spot right in here. And then in this spot, you do your exploring and you find an ability. and then you take that ability and you go back here, and then you can access like this area right here. But there's like, there are teleporters, but they're very specific. There's like one teleporter here that'll take you here, and then there's one teleporter right here that'll take you to here. They come in pairs. They're not like I can travel from this one to this one and then this one to whichever one I want. They're specific teleporters that lead you to specific locations. You see what I'm saying? Metroid Dread helped me realize that having fast travel in a Metroidvania isn't exclusively about convenience. If I told someone that Metroid Dread didn't have fast travel and they didn't know anything about the game, they might think, oh no, that's awful. You have to walk all the way across the map if you want to get to a certain part? Sounds painful. But it's not painful because Samus moves. She is fast, and covering ground is honestly not that hard. I don't think having a better fast travel would have benefited the game because it would have made things more convenient. I think a better fast travel would have benefited the game because it would have made the game less linear and offered up more freedom. These teleporters aren't designed to be fast travel. They're designed to be clever ways to have the linear path Samus takes to loop in on itself. But this is clearly purposeful design. There wouldn't be any point in fast traveling around unless you wanted to get more rocket ammo capacity, which, if you're anything like me, never ran out of anyway. You see, there aren't actually side quests in this game. There's no finding pale ore, then bringing it back to the nailsmith to craft a better nail. There's no giant young guy with an old man crawling out of him asking for quicksilver to upgrade your bile flasks. There's not even a shop or a storekeeper. There's no Bapanada. Bapanada. These side quests actually add to the freedom in Metroidvanias because they give you optional content that can upgrade your character, give you a reason to travel back to places you've already been, and in doing so enrich the world you're exploring. Metroid Dread is begging to have interesting NPCs. Could you imagine cool alien characters Metroid Dread could come up with? A robotic shopkeeper with different missiles you can unlock if you kill enough of a certain enemy type, a plant-like organism that upgrades how quickly your stamina recharges if you find other plants similar to it, a scientist raven guy who gives you special techniques to get past Emmys, etc, etc. Metroid Dread has like this Jarvis ball guy and an NPC who finds you halfway through the game to do a lore dump on you and then dies. And that's about all the NPC work Metroid Dread is willing to do because the game wants to keep you on rails. I think this is a good place for me to put a pin in my complaints. If it sounded like I was spending a lot of time complaining in this video, I think it's primarily because I expected a Metroid game to be a Metroidvania. That's where the name comes from, right? And yet I found that this genre is done better by indie games created by a handful of people as opposed to, you know, Metroid itself. I think I was at peace with the game around the latter half of the game, however. There's a really amazing sequence in which you have to retread the first area of the game. The twist is that this time around it's frozen over, and so now you can't travel through water that you used to be able to go through, as well as some doors have been frozen over, and you have to figure out what the issue is. I really love this sequence. It was my favorite part of the game. It kind of felt like brilliant level design to have this first area be two areas in one. A bunch of abilities you didn't have the first go around were necessary to go through on your second go around, because the ice forces you to go about the area differently. Hollow Knight kinda has a similar thing happen, but it doesn't turn an old area into a new area so much as it makes enemies stronger, blocks off a path or two, and feeds the narrative. The amount of foresight, planning, and tweaking that must have gone into this part of Metroid Dread to effectively make it two areas in a trench coat was genuinely impressive, at least to me. And you know what? That kinda just meant I was approaching the game wrong, I guess. I don't believe Metroid Dread is a good Metroidvania, but I'm not sure Metroid Dread was trying to be a good Metroidvania. And you know, maybe we should judge games by how well the authors accomplish what the author set out to do, right? So I hope I haven't deterred you from picking up the game if you haven't played it and decided to watch the video anyway. It's a really well-made game, just don't approach it like a Metroidvania. Think of it as a really long level that loops in on itself in creative and interesting ways. The artistic value of this game lies in its level design, art direction, atmosphere, and how the game feels to play. I look forward to playing more Metroid games in the future, now that I feel like I know how to approach them. I'm sure I will enjoy my experience a lot more with them than I did with Dread, because I've learned my lesson. Thanks for watching to the end, and I'll catch you later.